So, for my portion, I'm going to discuss higher education as a pathway to the U.S. workforce for males. And if a couple of driving concepts, if you believe in any way in the human capital development notion that higher education provides, developing our young people and those that can contribute significantly to our state and nation is a very important matter. Also, if you could still consider higher education to be a form of public good, that the way we marshal our resources and talents in that way is also an important dynamic to consider. And in doing those, it's not a large leap to recognize the impact that higher education plays in the U.S. workforce, particularly those that require post-secondary education training, but also how that ability to earn and pay also impacts our U.S. economy. That said, looking closely at the U.S. labor force participation rates, one aspect that you'll note that for prime age men, which is 25 to 54, which is the period where you most likely see a significant contribution to the workforce, is that you'll see since 1948 there's been a slow decline in participation in the workforce. And you can also see here that as we consider level of education, that it also tells a story about the likelihood of being a non-participant in the U.S. workforce. And the lower the education level, the higher likely a person is to be a non-participant in the U.S. workforce. Now, for a group like this, what's most important of the many reasons that are shared about why this may be the case is the significant gap that has grown over time in wages. The ratio between what a male in this prime age group range makes between someone with just a high school diploma versus someone with an undergraduate degree has moved from being approximately 84 cents on the dollar to now being right around 55 cents on the dollar. So if you don't have a undergraduate degree, you would be making on average about 55 cents on the dollar of someone with an undergraduate degree. And that is seen to be one of the major predictors for why individuals are choosing not to enter into the workforce because of the low payout rate there. Also, if you are able to see this, and perhaps not, that the participation rates in our prime age, if you look by group, you will note that the group that has the highest participation rate in this regard would be Hispanic and Latino males. And as we look at the opportunity spaces for growth in the U.S. workforce, growth in enrollment in higher education, and improving the level of which one can contribute at all these levels, there are opportunity spaces for that, particularly as it relates to groups that have historically not been major participants in our higher education workforce and could also help fulfill some of the high-tech and growing employment needs that we will see in our future. There are missed opportunities that I want to just speak briefly about here. One is that there's a missed opportunity when you look at the high incarceration rates of these men at the prime age that find themselves incarcerated, and you will see that these are potentially high participation rate opportunities in the workplace. It also plays out and bears out when you look at education level. When you look at the education level, it also plays a role in explaining, in some level, who might be more likely to find themselves incarcerated. So education, yet again, has an opportunity to make a difference. I'll speak about these two concurrently. So as it relates to post-secondary participation, as you will note across the enrollment rates and the graduation rates, both at the 2-year and 4-year college, that males across the board, across the nation, constitutes less than 45%. 45% of the enrollment and 45% of the graduation rates. Don't have time for anyone to guess on what this is. And I will tell you first that this diagram is not the performance of my retirement plan. But it is actually plotting the educational pathway for one of the groups that was on the chart before, and that is African American males. And these dots represent a key part along the pipeline: high school completion, college participation, total enrollment in higher education, bachelor's degree, master's degree, first professional degree, doctoral degree, full-time faculty, academic affairs, and then CEOs that work on college campuses. What I want you to look more closely at, though, is this area here, where a body like this could certainly play an important role in thinking carefully about what's happening when these young people enter these college campuses that allows such a precipitous drop of who goes, but who stays, and then ultimately who graduates. And just as a comparative point, these stars are their white male counterparts that demonstrate that while there still is a decline of who's participating, there's something that's occurring on our college campuses that requires some serious attention to fully understand why is it that males of color are dropping out at a rate or not fulfilling an opportunity that they clearly had a desire in when they enrolled in our college campuses. So what should we know going forward here? So the full story. So the full story here is it's not a new dynamic that there's a question of male underachievement. They've been asking this question across the globe for quite some time. 8 years ago, I published a piece that looked at male underachievement across the globe, and we collected the data 2 years preceding that. And this is a question globally that's been asked, and it's something now I think we're beginning to think about here in the U.S. We're also beginning to ask the question on our college campuses: do we need additional services for men? And the question here, though, is not just all men, right? That it's talking about the realities that there, in some cases, are not identifiable services for white males on campus. If you aren't in fraternities, if you aren't in certain social groups, where do you go when you have questions? Where do you go when you need support groups? And that's a question that is being asked because in some places and sometimes campuses are uncomfortable and don't know how to quite address the question. But the question is being asked. Now it's a question of how do you get to the appropriate answer. And then there's also the question of why, as you all are asking here too, as relates to males or men being a new minority. And what's coded in this language is the question is, well, why is it that we often talk about just the males of color, which I think you'll hear more about, but we don't talk about the decline in participation of white males on college campuses and graduation rates as well? Because when we look at and we hear about these total enrollments, the total enrollments of an overwhelming majority of our institutions are not of color. So when we look at the percentage distribution is largely going to be driven on a gender standpoint by white males. And there are examples now of institutions that have taken the step. of creating men institutions and men centers on campuses to make these services readily available. So, in closing, it's not a new story, but it is certainly one that if we want to think carefully about the type of human capital we have available and how we might find a pathway to improving our college enrollment and our workforce, is that we have to pay attention to this decline and recognize this decline is across the board for all males and not just certain groups. And this also has bared itself into the number of males that still live at home with their parents, which has increased 100% over 20 years. And that as we ask the question, oftentimes of what's happening to young boys and men, we also need to think carefully about the systems at which they're interacting in and how can schools and higher education institutions think about improving opportunities. I do want to accentuate a point, though, that the decline in participation in males of success should not disrupt any discussion around the hard-fought victories of females, and that it should not serve as an emphasis of competition. And then lastly here, as we have these discussions, disentangling them as it relates to race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status is important because there are great opportunities as it relates to opportunities for African American and Latino males, particularly in enrollment in higher education in the workforce, particularly as you look at the participation rates, but also that we must consider in that context white males. What is the role of white males in these goals that you have set, and how might white males help you to meet these goals? Thank you.